All right, today we're going to be talking about a scientist who had an enormous impact and really created an entire field of science through his research, and that is the work of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is an incredibly important figure in science, and really he's called the father of genetics. Without his research, we would have probably, it would have been several more years before we figured out a lot of the rules and a lot of the laws that he was able to figure out. And so Gregor Mendel was an interesting character, not just because he was a scientist, but he was also a monk. So Gregor Mendel was a monk. He worked in a monastery, and during his free time, he thought, I've got some downtime while working in this monastery. And he had trained as a classical scientist. He'd gone to university, he'd studied science, but went the way of joining and being in the church. And so he thought, while I'm doing all this stuff at the monastery, I've got some free time, I've got some space here, I am going to carry out some experiments. And he didn't really go into his experiments saying, I'm going to figure out genetics. It just so happened that through all of these different things that he did, we then found his work later after he passed, and scientists said, wow, this is what we've been looking for. This is huge. So he studied heredity. He studied how one living thing inherits its characteristics from its parents. And really, like I said, he just kind of started off with some small experiments, and it grew into something very, very big. And so let's talk about what it was that he did. Mendel chose to study the inheritance in plants, and specifically pea plants. And this was a very smart choice. Simply because if you choose animals, then you have to feed them, you have to keep them in cages, you have to make sure that they don't breed when you don't want them to, right? So by choosing plants, it really simplified the process. You don't have to put them in cages, you don't have to worry about them sneaking around on you at night, and so Mendel had some things in place that really allowed him to control these crosses even more between these plants. But specifically, pea plants was a good choice. One, you got peas out of it, and so they could eat them. But secondly, they had a lot of characteristics that Mendel was able to compare and contrast. For example, they produce a large number of offspring. Okay, so when they're producing their seeds, they're producing a large number. They reproduce sexually, like most plants do. Looking at a plant, you wouldn't think that, but most plants have male and female reproductive parts so that they can reproduce sexually and produce seeds that are a cross between two different plants as parents. He also found that he could artificially cross-pollinate these pea plants. And what I mean by that is, imagine you have a flower. Okay. And down inside the flower, you have the female part of the plant. And then sticking up here above the plant, you have the male part. These are the stamen, and on that stamen, you're going to find pollen. Okay. Pollen is the reproductive cell, the male reproductive cell of a flower. So if you're allergic to pollen, that's what you're allergic to, is the male reproductive cells of a flower. So we'll call this plant A. Okay. Normally what happens in any given environment is plant A is going to look to get pollinated by another plant, okay, of the same species. How does that happen? That happens with pollinators. So this is plant B. We have a bee that comes along, okay, and that bee is going to come along and get nectar from this flower. While it's getting nectar, it inadvertently picks up some pollen on its belly, and then it flies over to this plant, gets some more nectar, and while it does, it brushes up against this plant, and that pollen that was on its belly now falls down into the female part of this plant. You now have this plant producing seeds that are a combination of the two plants. Okay? Mendel did not want that to happen. Okay, and he knew it would be very difficult to control pollinators. So what he did was he simply removed the male reproductive part of some of his plants, okay, and said, you guys are not producing pollen. Okay, So then he was able to artificially cross-pollinate these plants. So he got rid of the bees, and he would put nets over his plants as well to prevent this from happening. But then he could simply just take a paintbrush, and he could get pollen from this plant and then transfer it to this plant. So that way he knew exactly which plant was pollinating the other plant. And he kept meticulous records of all the tens of thousands of crosses that he did. He kept track of every single one of them. So plant number 265 was crossed with plant number 874, and then these seeds, and then he grew all the seeds and labeled all them and crossed them and labeled all the crosses and described what happened. So he was very, very meticulous, which is why when we found his work, we were like, wow, this is a whole new field of science. This just wasn't some guy screwing around in his backyard. He was serious about what he was doing. In addition to being able to cross-pollinate his plants, the plants themselves also had a lot of contrasting characters. So flower color, how tall they were, the color of the pea pod, the shape of the peas, all of that played into his ability to really take a deep look at what was happening in the inheritance of these traits. So a couple things before we go any further that I want to make sure we define. Fertilization. Fertilization is the process where we're joining together a male and a female reproductive cell. So the pollen from this plant is combining with the reproductive cells of this plant, and that's fertilization. It's just like in humans when we have egg combining with sperm, that's fertilization. That creates a zygote, okay, but that's those two reproductive cells coming together. And then another term to be sure we're familiar with is true breeding. True breeding simply means if a plant is allowed to self-pollinate, it's going to produce offspring identical to itself. And so the only real way to do that, if we're thinking back to genotypes, if these were true breeding plants, this one would have to have 2 identical alleles, and this one would have to have 2 identical alleles. Okay? The alleles would have to be the same. That way, no matter what, when they produce, if they self-pollinate, and if self-pollinating, what they're going to do is the pollen's just going to fall straight down into the flower. Okay, so the male would have this genotype, the male reproductive cell, and the female would have this reproductive cell, and so you're going to get a copy of that. Okay, that's what it means to be true breeding. And true breeding was important for Mendel's experiment because he had to have a starting point. He had to have something that he couldn't just take plants and just randomly be like, I don't know what their genotype is. We're just going to start and see. So Mendel started by having 2 true breeding plants, and he crossed 2 true breeding plants with one another. The trait that he was looking at was plant height. That's the first one that he examined. Okay, and he found that there was a tall version and then a short version. Okay, so he took a true breeding tall plant and he crossed it with a true breeding short plant. So basically he allowed these plants to pollinate themselves over and over again. He kept getting tall plants. He said, okay, they're good. They're tall. He allowed these to self-pollinate. They kept producing short plants. Okay, good. They're short. So he has a true breeding tall with a true breeding short. That was his initial cross. Okay, so we put that on a Punnett square. True breeding tall goes up here. Take our short plant and put it over here. When he crossed these, okay, this is what he wound up with. Okay, and if we remember about dominant and recessive alleles, what we're going to know and what we're going to immediately recognize is that every single plant that he produced, all those seeds, right? So he took these 2 plants, he crossed them, he harvested the seeds, he planted the seeds and waited and watered them and waited for them to grow, and every single one of them was tall. Now, I don't know what was going through Mendel's mind, but I know it would be going through my mind at that time. Oh my gosh, I just ruined all plants, right? Because I've somehow made the short plants disappear. And maybe he thought that. Because that's not what he expected to have happen, right? He crossed a tall plant with a short plant. He didn't know what was going to happen. Maybe there'd be some tall, some short. Maybe they would all be medium height, okay? He didn't really know. He was the first person to really start playing around with this sort of stuff. But what he got was all tall plants, okay? They all shared the same trait of just one of the parents, okay? And so from this, he was able to draw 2 conclusions. One of them was that biological inheritance is determined by some type of factor passed from one generation to the next. He didn't call it genes yet. He didn't know what it was. He just says that there's got to be some factor that's being passed from these offspring, because this parent passed it on and this parent may or may not have, but all of these plants are tall, right? What happened to the short plant? And that led him to his second conclusion, was that they're what we call the principle of dominance. And he said that after several experiments like this, he said that some alleles must be dominant and some alleles must be recessive. He recognized that these dominant alleles were masking these recessive alleles, because when he went on and did further experiments, he found that the recessive alleles had reappeared in the population. So Mendel really laid the groundwork for what we know about genetics. Most of the laws and things that we still use to this day are the result of the work and dedication of Gregor Mendel.